Hi everyone, welcome to another video. So for this one, we are going to be making a single piece covered jar. I've learned this to be called a chopstick box, and that's because the person showing me was using the back end of a chopstick to actually make the indentation for the lid gallery. But to get started, you're gonna at least want to have basic skills for throwing a cylinder and have already approached trying to throw closed forms. So it is important to actually be aware of your wall thickness. You just want to make sure that they're even and just check in with yourself and actually be mindful of what that thickness actually is, because that will determine how far you push your tool in later. For those new to making closed forms or any kind of constricted necked form like a bottle or something like that, you're gonna notice my hand position here, and I'll use those 6 points of pressure with my thumbs, my index finger, and my middle finger knuckle all working together. And what I'm trying to do is constrict the neck in, and it's gonna be a gradual movement towards the center, and I'm gonna bounce back and forth between throwing that portion and constricting that portion. Every time you constrict the neck to make it more narrow, it's going to get a little bit thicker. So by making sure to do that, you'll actually end up with a much more even wall thickness. And any inconsistencies that you might have in your wall thickness are going to get translated to the rim. So you can see I have a little bit of a wobble going. That's not really that big of a deal because it is going to get pinched off later. And what I'm doing right here is actually using my needle tool to remove any moisture or any excess slip that's on the inside wall. And in my experience, doing this really does help prevent cracks from forming later on. And you'll see a little bit later exactly how I do that. So as this comes together, you'll see a little bit of a knob developing, and you can actually leave that there and make it into a knob if you would like. So a rule of thumb I like to share with my students: for any lid that's a cap lid like this will end up being, and your hand can easily fit over the top of it to pick it up, there's no real utilitarian reason to actually require a knob. However, knobs and finials are aesthetic decisions, and it's really up to the individual to decide whether their work needs them or not. So for beginners that are doing this for the first time, I usually recommend that they stick to a really simple shape. So you can see here I have a really vertical straight wall, and the top of the form has a slight dome to it. For the portion where you're actually going to be making the indentation that's going to create the gallery, I'm using a small piece that I cut from the flexible metal rib because that's what I had laying around. I usually and prefer to use a popsicle stick, and I'll sand it down on one side so that it's nice and flat, and I find that thickness is actually perfect for making these galleries. The idea here is to just be resourceful and use what you have, and as long as whatever you have gives you a 3/8 of an inch groove, you'll be okay. When you actually start pressing into the pot to make this groove, the idea is to just be as steady as you possibly can. I usually focus my eye onto the bottom corner and just make sure that I'm going perfectly straight into the pot, because the flatter that groove is, the easier it is going to be to actually cut it from the base and remove the lid later. And once the pot has firmed up just a little bit, you'll want to actually make sure to poke a hole so that you can release some of the air during the drying process. And I'll usually poke that hole on the seam that I intend on cutting later. So if you want the flange to be a part of the lid, then you put the hole on the bottom seam, or if you want the flange to be a part of the body, then you put the hole on the top seam. So I'm going to come back with my needle now and just really carefully and slowly start cutting off the rim, and you can see my left hand is just ready to catch it, and my wheel speed is relatively slow so that this doesn't just go flying off. You might have noticed by now that I haven't removed this pot from the bat. I just do that because it makes centering a lot easier, but you can also just use clay lugs like if you were centering your pot for trimming. So once you pop the lid off, you can see there's a little bit of a burr now, and that needs to be removed before these two pieces can actually fit together. So if you just really gently flip the lid into the body, and you'll just be able to trim away any of those burrs. Sometimes if your hand is a little unsteady as you're making your groove when it's first being thrown, that shelf is a little rounded, so I just went back and trued up that edge to make it a little more flat so that when the two pieces actually come together, they're going to fit really snugly. So getting the right fit does take some practice, and even with as often as I do these little jars, it does take some trial and error for the test fit to just be right. So what I'll typically do is start with the lid, and I'll get that flange all cleaned up just how I would want it, and then I will move on to the body of the jar and remove the burrs from this before actually trying to get the lid to fit on. As the lid gets closer and closer to actually fitting, I'm going to get really delicate with my trimming tool and only remove really minimal amounts of clay with each little pass. And what this is going to ensure is that I don't go too far and have a really wiggly lid later on. So with the lid now fitting and in place, I'll leave the pot on the bat still, and I'll start to trim the outside, and this will just allow for a nice smooth clean profile, and there's almost no separation of where the actual lid and the body start. So if you're going for those, really smooth forms, this is a nice way of going about it. It's also a good time for you to put any kind of texture that you like to do while trimming on the outside of the object. So as mentioned before, when I actually closed the form in, I removed all moisture and any excess slip to try to prevent cracking. And now I'm going to use this dowel to compress from the inside, and this will just ensure that I don't get any S-cracks developing later. And it's important to support on the back side here. So I have my fingers on the opposite side of where the dowel is, and I'm just compressing the dowel and my fingers together so that seam is really nice and compacted. However you choose to treat the bottoms of your pot is how you're going to address finishing this. I like to trim a nice tall foot on most of my work, so that's all I'm doing here. Please let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and I'd be happy to address them. If you like the video, please like it, and if you want to subscribe, I'll try to put some more of these videos out for the future. But thanks for watching.